Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most troubling questions, one that sits at the intersection of power and madness, of promise and catastrophe. We've travelled together through one of history's darkest chapters, watched a prince become a king, become a monster, traced the slow unraveling of a mind and the near destruction of a city. It's been a heavy journey, full of difficult questions and uncomfortable truths, full of choices that had no good options and people who did terrible things for complicated reasons. The Mad King's story is not a comfortable one, not a tale that ends with simple lessons or easy morals. It's messy and tragic and human in all the ways that history tends to be when we look at it honestly. But you've stayed with me through all of it, through the madness and the wildfire, through the choices that saved a city and the compromises that stained a regime. Thank you for that patience, for that willingness to sit with discomfort and complexity, to contemplate questions without demanding simple answers. If you found some value in this journey, if these contemplative nights help you find peace at the end of difficult days, a like and subscription would mean a great deal. And to those already part of this community, who return night after night for these slow drifts through history and story, thank you. You make this worthwhile. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of unrelenting horror and cruelty, though darkness there certainly was. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the life of Aerys Targaryen, the political landscape that shaped him, the relationships that defined him, the traumas that broke him, and the choices that led him down the path to infamy. We'll examine the human story behind the terrible acts, the people who enabled him and those who finally stopped him, the common folk who suffered under his reign and the realm that had to rebuild after his fall. By the end, I think you'll find that madness is rarely simple, that power amplifies what lies within us, and that understanding doesn't require forgiveness. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, both real and legendary, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community. Your presence makes these journeys more meaningful, so settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and feel it move through you. And let's begin our slow drift through the story of Aerys II Targaryen, the king who would be remembered forever as the Mad King. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story of one man's unraveling, one city's near destruction, and one realm's transformation unfold before you like pages in an old book, read by candlelight in a quiet room. The world can wait. For now, there are only voices from the past and the quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. Before we can understand what Aerys became, we need to understand what he was, and that requires stepping back into a time before the madness, before the paranoia, before the wildfire and the screaming and the terrible end. We need to see the prince, not yet the monster, and understand the world that shaped him. Aerys Targaryen was born in the 244th year after Aegon's conquest, in a time when the Targaryen dynasty seemed secure if diminished from its former glory. The dragons were long gone, extinct for nearly a century since the sickly creature that died during the reign of Aegon III, but the Targaryens still ruled, still maintained their ancient customs, still believed in their own exceptionalism. The Iron Throne sat in the Red Keep, and a Targaryen sat upon it, and that was simply the way of things. He was born to King Jaehaerys II and Queen Shaera, themselves brother and sister wed in the traditional Targaryen manner. His birth was considered fortunate, a healthy son arriving without complication, and the realm celebrated as realms do when a prince is born. The bells rang in King's Landing, the small folk drank toasts to the new prince's health, and the great lords sent gifts and pledges of loyalty. It was all very proper, very traditional, very unremarkable. What was remarkable, though, was the boy himself. Aerys was beautiful, as Targaryens often were. Silver gold hair that caught the light, purple eyes of an unusual depth and clarity, features that were fine and aristocratic. But beyond the physical beauty that was his birthright, there was something else. Intelligence, charm, a certain brightness that everyone who met him remarked upon. He was quick-witted, clever with words, able to make people laugh, or think or feel at ease in his presence. As a boy, Aerys showed every sign of becoming an exceptional king. He learned his lessons well, studied history and law with genuine interest, rather than mere dutiful compliance. He was physically graceful, showing promise with sword and lance, though he would never be a great warrior. He had his mother's thoughtfulness and his father's sense of duty, or so it seemed to those who watched him grow, and he had a friend. Perhaps the most important relationship in young Aerys's life, certainly the one that would shape everything that followed, was his friendship with Tywin Lannister. Tywin was the heir to Casterly Rock, son of the weak and ineffectual Tytos Lannister, a boy as brilliant and ambitious as Aerys himself. They met as children when Tywin's father brought him to court, and they recognised something in each other immediately. A kinship of capability, of ambition, of knowing they were meant for great things. The two boys were inseparable. They studied together, trained together, competed with each other in the way that bright young men do, pushing each other to excel. Aerys was the prince, of course, destined for the throne, but Tywin was his match in intelligence and far exceeded him in discipline and patience. Together they seemed to promise a golden age, the charming, clever king and his brilliant, capable hand. It was a partnership that everyone assumed would define the next generation of rule in Westeros. But there were already shadows, small things that perhaps should have warned those paying attention. Aerys was brilliant, yes, but he was also mercurial. His mood shifted quickly, from joy to anger and back again. He hated to lose, even in games, and would sulk or rage when bested. He was generous and charming when things went his way, but quick to take offence when they didn't. He loved being the centre of attention, needed the admiration and approval of those around him. And he was jealous. Even in those early years, even of his closest friend, there was jealousy. When Tywin excelled at something Aerys could not match, when the maesters praised Tywin's essays or the master-at-arms commended his sword work, Aerys would smile and congratulate his friend. But something would flash in those purple eyes, something that looked like resentment, quickly hidden but undeniably there. These were small things, character flaws that many people possess without becoming monsters. Jealousy, vanity, a need for approval. These are human weaknesses, not harbingers of atrocity. But in a prince, in someone destined for absolute power, such weaknesses could grow into something far more dangerous. Power, as they say, doesn't corrupt so much as it reveals. And what it would eventually reveal in Aerys Targaryen was something terrible. When Aerys was 18 years old, in the 262nd year after the conquest, he was married to his sister Rhaella. This was not a love match, not even a match of political necessity in the traditional sense. It was demanded by prophecy, or at least by the interpretation of prophecy by a woodswitch known as the Ghost of High Heart. This strange woman had told King Jaehaerys that the prince that was promised would be born of Aerys and Rhaella's line, that their joining was necessary for the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. Neither Aerys nor Rhaella wanted the marriage. Rhaella was said to love another, one of her household knights, though nothing improper had occurred between them. Aerys himself had his eye on other women he found more exciting or beautiful or interesting than his quiet, dutiful sister. But the king commanded, and the prince and princess obeyed. They were wed with appropriate ceremony, blessed by the High Septon, celebrated by the realm. The marriage was unhappy from the start. Rhaella performed her duty, but there was no warmth between the siblings, no affection beyond what courtesy demanded. Aerys grew to resent her, perhaps because she was a constant reminder that even a prince must sometimes bend to the will of others, or perhaps simply because proximity breeds contempt. He would later treat her with casual cruelty, but in those early years he simply ignored her when he could. The marriage was also cursed with tragedy. Rhaella became pregnant repeatedly, but the pregnancy ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. The masters could offer no explanation. The babies were simply born dead or died within hours, small broken things that broke their parents' hearts. For Rhaella, this was an ongoing trauma, a source of deep grief. For Aerys, it was a humiliation and a source of paranoia. He began to suspect poison, to believe that enemies were somehow causing these deaths, though who would do such a thing and how remained unclear. Finally, in the 259th year after the conquest, a child survived. A son. Born on the very day of the great tragedy at Summerhall. The circumstances of this birth were extraordinary and terrible. King Jaehaerys and his heir, Prince Duncan, had gathered at the royal summer palace of Summerhall with maesters and pyromancers, attempting to hatch dragon eggs through some ancient ritual. Something went wrong. The palace burned. The king died in the flames, along with Prince Duncan, Sir Duncan the Tall of the King's Guard. And others. It was a catastrophe that shocked the realm. But from that catastrophe, from that fire, came Prince Rhaegar. Born in smoke and salt and grief, the prophecy said, though which prophecy and what it meant was never entirely clear. The boy was beautiful and melancholy from the start, as if he had somehow absorbed the sorrow of the day of his birth. He would grow to be a remarkable young man, thoughtful and dutiful and sad, carrying the weight of prophecy on his shoulders, for Aerys. Rhaegar's birth was vindication. He had a son, an heir, proof that he could produce the next generation of Targaryens. But the shadow of Summerhall hung over everything. His father and brother had died trying to bring back dragons, trying to recapture the old Targaryen glory. They had failed, and their failure had cost them everything. It was a lesson about the danger of obsessing over lost power, about trying to reclaim what was gone. Aerys would fail to learn this lesson. When Jaehaerys died at Summerhall, Aerys became king. He was 24 years old, handsome and clever, with a beautiful son and a loyal friend in Tywin Lannister. The realm looked to him with hope. He had every advantage, every opportunity to be a good king, perhaps even a great one. The small character flaws, the jealousy and vanity and mercurial temper, seemed like things that maturity and responsibility might temper. The coronation was magnificent. Aerys wore the crown of Aegon the Conqueror, sat upon the iron throne that Aegon had forged from the swords of defeated enemies, and accepted the homage of the great lords of Westeros. He looked every inch the king, and he clearly loved it. The attention, the ceremony, the power, it all seemed to intoxicate him. But he also seemed aware of his responsibilities, speaking of justice and prosperity and peace. Those who witnessed his coronation left feeling reassured. The realm would be in good hands. One of Aerys's first acts as king was to name Tywin Lannister as his hand. Tywin was young for such a position, only 25, but his brilliance was undeniable, and his friendship with Aerys made him the obvious choice. Together, the two young men would rule the Seven Kingdoms, combining Aerys's charm and vision with Tywin's administrative genius. It seemed perfect, a partnership that would define the age, and for a time, it was. The early years of Aerys's reign were good years. The realm prospered, trade flourished. The king's peace was kept. Problems were addressed efficiently and fairly. To the common people and the lords alike, it seemed that the gamble of placing a young king on the throne had paid off. Aerys II was proving to be a worthy successor to the great Targaryen kings of the past. But those close to the king, those who saw him daily in the Red Keep, might have noticed small things. The way his moods shifted without apparent cause, the way he would fixate on slights, real or imagined, and brood over them. The way his laughter could be just a bit too loud, his anger just a bit too quick. The way he took credit for successes that were largely Tywin's work while blaming others for failures. These were small things. Troubling perhaps, but not alarming. Many kings have been vain or temperamental. Many have needed capable hands to manage the day-to-day work of governance, while they focused on the pageantry and ceremony. There was no reason yet to fear, no sign that the charming prince had anything monstrous lurking beneath the surface. No one could know in those early years what was coming. No one could see the seeds of madness already planted, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Aerys was the king, Tywin was his hand, Rhaegar was the beautiful heir, and the realm was at peace. It was a golden time, or it seemed to be, and perhaps that's what made the darkness that followed so much more terrible. The fall from light to shadow is always worse than dwelling in shadow all along. The story of how that fall happened, how a promising king became a mad tyrant, how paranoia and cruelty replaced charm and capability, is a story worth understanding. Not to excuse what Aerys became, but to comprehend how such transformations happen, how the human mind can break, and how power in the hands of a broken mind can lead to catastrophe. For now, though, let's pause with young King Aerys on his throne, his crown on his head, his friend at his side, his son in the nursery, and the realm at peace. Let's hold this moment before moving forward into the darkness, because once we begin that descent, there will be no climbing back. The first decade of Aerys's reign is often overlooked in the histories, overshadowed by the horrors that came later. But these years matter, because they show us what might have been, and help us understand how what was became what would be. They were years of genuine accomplishment, of competent governance, of a realm that functioned well and prospered. They were also the years when the cracks began to show, when the small character flaws began to widen into dangerous fissures. Tywin Lannister proved to be perhaps the most capable hand of the king in Westerosi history. He was ruthlessly efficient, utterly disciplined, and possessed of a mind that could grasp the complex machinery of governance and make it run smoothly. He reformed the tax system, eliminating corruption and ensuring that royal revenues actually reached the crown. He improved the roads and harbours, understanding that commerce was the foundation of prosperity. He appointed competent men to positions of authority based on merit rather than favouritism, creating an administration that actually worked. Under Tywin's management, the crown's debt, which had been considerable when Aerys took the throne, was paid down and eventually eliminated. The royal treasury, which had been nearly empty, filled with gold. The small folk found their taxes lower and their lives more secure. The lords found their disputes settled fairly and their legitimate grievances addressed. It was everything good governance should be, practical and effective and creating real improvements in people's lives. But here was the problem, the crack that would eventually break everything. Tywin was too good at his job. He was so competent, so effective, that people began to speak of him rather than Aerys when they discussed the government. Quote 0, they would say, quote 1. It wasn't said with particular malice, just as an acknowledgement of reality. But such acknowledgements have a way of reaching royal ears. Aerys heard these whispers, these casual observations that his hand was the true power behind the throne, and they gnawed at him. He had always been jealous of Tywin's capabilities, even as a boy, but now that jealousy had a focus, a narrative, he wasn't being given credit for the prosperity he had brought the realm. Tywin was stealing his glory, making himself seem indispensable, turning the king into a figurehead. This was, of course, largely in Aerys's mind. Tywin was scrupulous about showing deference to the king, about attributing successes to Aerys's wise leadership. But Tywin's very competence was a kind of reproach. The more effectively he ran the realm, the more obvious it became that Aerys was not doing so. And Aerys was intelligent enough to recognise this, which only made the resentment worse. The king began to undermine his hand in small ways. He would reverse Tywin's decisions without explanation, not because the decisions were bad, but simply to assert his authority. He would make appointments without consulting Tywin, often choosing less qualified men simply because they were more personally loyal to him. He would make grand pronouncements about policies and initiatives, then lose interest and leave Tywin to manage the details or quietly abandon the projects when they proved impractical. Tywin endured this with his characteristic stoicism. He understood what was happening, understood the psychology of a king who felt overshadowed by his own hand, and he adjusted his approach. He became even more careful about showing deference, about ensuring that credit went to Aerys. He tried to manage the king's ego while still managing the realm, a delicate balancing act that required constant attention. But this dynamic, this need to constantly manage the king's insecurities, was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. And it created an environment where Aerys's worst impulses were rarely checked, where saying no to the king or questioning his judgment became increasingly difficult. During these years, Aerys developed a number of expensive enthusiasms that Tywin had to finance and manage. He wanted to build a new palace that would dwarf the Red Keep, all white marble and towering spires, the most magnificent structure in the known world. Tywin quietly determined that this was financially impossible and politically unwise, and managed to delay the project until Aerys lost interest. He wanted to invade the Stepstones and establish a new Valyrian colony, reconquering the lost territories of the old empire, again. Tywin managed to forestall this scheme through a combination of logistical objections and strategic delays. These grandiose plans revealed something about Aerys's state of mind. He wanted to do something spectacular, something that would make him memorable, that would prove he was a great king in his own right. He was intelligent enough to recognize that presiding over a well-run realm, while valuable, wasn't particularly exciting or glorious. He wanted his own field of fire, his own conquest, his own accomplishment that would make the history books remember him as exceptional. Tywin understood this desire and, to his credit, tried to channel it in productive directions. He encouraged Aerys to hold grand tournaments, to patron artists and scholars, to focus on the ceremonial aspects of kingship that he enjoyed and did well. For a time this worked. Aerys became known for hosting magnificent tournaments and celebrations, for the splendour of his court, for the wit of his conversation and the charm of his presence. These were not small things. A king who makes his court a centre of culture and celebration, who draws the great lords together in fellowship, who gives the small folk spectacles to enjoy and take pride in. Such a king serves a real function. But Aerys wanted more. He wanted to be seen as powerful, not just prestigious, wise, not just witty, feared, not just loved, and he increasingly resented that Tywin was the one actually wielding power while he performed for the crowds. The relationship between the king and his hand became more strained with each passing year. There were no dramatic breaks, no public confrontations, just a slow erosion of the friendship that had once seemed so genuine and deep. They still worked together, still presented a united front to the realm, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a cold formality that everyone around them could sense. Aerys began to surround himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. Sycophants and flatterers found their way into the king's inner circle. People who praised his brilliance and agreed with his every pronouncement. Tywin tried to counter this influence, tried to ensure that the king received honest counsel, but it became increasingly difficult. One of the most significant and ominous additions to the small council during this period was Varys, the eunuch spy master who came from across the narrow sea. Varys was brilliant in his way, a master of whispers who knew everything that happened in King's Landing and much that happened beyond. Aerys was fascinated by him, by the exotic nature of his service, by the secrets he could provide. Varys told the king things, whispered in his ear about plots and conspiracies, about who was loyal and who might be harbouring treasonous thoughts. Whether these whispers were true, partially true, or complete fabrications designed to increase Varys's influence over the king, is a matter of debate among historians. What's certain is that they fed Aerys's growing paranoia, his sense that he was surrounded by enemies and false friends. Tywin distrusted Varys intensely and counselled against relying on him, but this only seemed to make Aerys more determined to listen to his master of whisperers. The king's marriage remained unhappy. Rhaella had given him his heir, and she had given him a daughter, Princess Shaena. in the 267th year after the conquest. But there was no love between them, barely even companionship. Aerys took mistresses, which was common enough among kings and nobles, but he seemed to take a cruel pleasure in flaunting them before Rhaella, in humiliating her publicly. It was an unpleasant side of his character. This need to hurt those who couldn't strike back. Young Prince Rhaegar was growing into a remarkable child, beautiful and thoughtful, and already showing signs of his future melancholy nature. He loved music and poetry, spent hours reading in the library, was gentle with his sister and courteous to everyone. He seemed to be everything a prince should be, and Aerys took pride in him, though there was something distant in that pride, as if the king saw his son more as a reflection of his own success than as a person in his own right. The realm continued to prosper through these years. The harvests were good, the winters mild, trade flourished and the king's peace held. From the outside, looking at the realm as a whole, everything seemed well. The crown was solvent, the small folk were relatively content, and the great lords were kept in line through a combination of Tywin's competent management and Aerys's sporadic displays of royal authority. But those inside the Red Keep, those who saw the king daily, might have noticed the changes. Aerys's temper grew shorter and more unpredictable. He would fly into rages over small things, perceived slights or minor setbacks, ranting and shouting before calming down just as suddenly. He became obsessed with his appearance, spending hours with his barbers and tailors, insisting that his clothing and grooming be perfect. He drank more wine than was wise, and when drunk he became either overly affectionate or viciously cruel, with no middle ground. There were incidents, small cruelties that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the surface. A servant who displeased him might be beaten. A lord who questioned his judgment might find himself humiliated before the court. Nothing that crossed the line into true tyranny. Nothing that would shock the sensibilities of a medieval society where power was often enforced through casual brutality, but enough to trouble those who remembered the charming Prince Aerys had been. Tywin tried to moderate these impulses, tried to prevent the king from actions he would later regret, but his ability to do so was limited and diminishing. A hand can advise, can counsel, can even argue, but ultimately the king is the king. And Aerys was increasingly unwilling to accept counsel that contradicted his desires. The question the historians have debated for generations is whether Aerys was already mad during these years, or whether these were simply the character flaws of a vain, insecure, and increasingly isolated man with too much power. The line between mental illness and mere character weakness is not always clear, particularly when viewed from centuries away. What we can say is that Aerys was showing signs of instability, of poor judgment, of impulses that a healthier mind or a less powerful position might have controlled. But he was still functional, still capable of acting the part of king when he chose to, still able to charm when he wanted to charm and to think strategically when he focused his attention. The madness, if it was madness, had not yet consumed him. That transformation would require a catalyst, a trauma that would break something fundamental in his mind and release the darkness fully. That catalyst came in the 277th year after the conquest, in a relatively minor castle town called Duskendale, in an incident that would forever change the king and, through him, the realm. What happened at Duskendale, those 6 months of captivity and humiliation and terror, would shatter whatever remained of Aerys's sanity and create the monster that history would remember as the Mad King. Before we move to that terrible turning point, though, let's pause and reflect on what we've seen. A prince with flaws but also gifts, capable of inspiring loyalty and affection. A king who began with genuine desire to rule well, to make his mark on history, to be worthy of the crown he wore. A man whose insecurities and jealousies were understandable, even relatable, human weaknesses that many possess without becoming monsters. The tragedy of Aerys Targaryen is not just what he became, but what he might have been. With different circumstances, with better counsel that he was willing to accept, with less power or more humility, he might have been remembered as a decent king. Perhaps not great, but not terrible. The realm might have continued its prosperity under his reign, and he might have passed the crown peacefully to Rhaegar when the time came. But that's not what happened, and understanding that other path, that possibility that was lost, makes the actual path all the more tragic. We mourn not just for those who would suffer under the Mad King's reign, but for the man himself, for the potential that was wasted, for the soul that was broken and became something monstrous. The wheel of history was turning, carrying everyone toward the catastrophe at Duskendale and everything that would follow. The promising prince had become a troubled king, and soon he would become something far worse. The descent had begun, though perhaps no one fully recognized it yet. The shadows were gathering, and soon they would swallow everything in darkness. The incident at Duskendale began, as catastrophes often do, with a relatively minor dispute. Lord Dennis Darklyn, the Lord of Duskendale, had requested certain rights and privileges from the Crown, trade concessions and tax exemptions that would have benefited his port town. These were not unreasonable requests in themselves, the kind of petitions that lords routinely made and that were routinely negotiated through the normal channels of governance. Tywin Lannister, as Hand of the King, had been managing these negotiations, offering some concessions while denying others, seeking the compromise that would satisfy Lord Darklyn without setting precedents that would lead to similar demands from every other lord in the realm. But Lord Darklyn, or perhaps more accurately his wife Lady Sarala, who was said to be the true power in Duskendale, was not satisfied with Tywin's measured approach. They wanted the king's personal attention, his direct approval, his stamp of royal authority on their requests. They invited Aerys to visit Duskendale, to see their prosperous town for himself, to hear their petition directly. It was a trap, though whether planned from the beginning or an opportunity seized in the moment, the histories do not agree. Tywin counselled against the visit. He sensed something off in the invitation, some desperation or calculation that made him uneasy. He argued that the king's time was too valuable to spend on minor provincial disputes, that such matters were precisely what a hand was for. But Aerys, in the way that had become typical, heard this counsel as an attempt by Tywin to control him, to keep him from exercising his own authority. If Tywin didn't want him to go, then he would go, if only to prove that he was king and could do as he pleased. Aerys travelled to Duskendale in the second moon of the 277th year after the conquest, accompanied by a small guard and a few members of his court. It was meant to be a brief visit, a day or two at most. He would hear Lord Darklyn's petition, make some grand pronouncement that would satisfy the Lord's vanity while giving Tywin room to negotiate the actual details later, and return to King's Landing having asserted his authority and undermined his hand's attempts to control him. It was a petty motivation, but petty motivations drive much of human behaviour, particularly among those with power and insecurity in equal measure. What happened when Aerys arrived at Duskendale is somewhat disputed in the details, but clear in its essentials. Lord Darklyn presented his requests, and Aerys, perhaps feeling expansive or perhaps simply wanting to spite Tywin, by granting what his hand had been negotiating away, agreed to more than was wise. Then, when Aerys prepared to leave, Darklyn made his move. He declared that the king was his prisoner, that he would hold him hostage until his demands were met in full, until he received guarantees and concessions that went far beyond what any subject could reasonably expect from his sovereign. It was an act of breathtaking foolishness and desperation. Taking a king hostage is not something that ends well for the hostage-taker, not in a feudal society where the entire structure of power rests on the sanctity of the monarch's person. But Darklyn had perhaps convinced himself that the crown needed him, needed Duskendale's port and revenues, needed to avoid the embarrassment of having its king held captive. Or perhaps Lady Sarala had convinced him of these things. She was said to be ambitious and reckless, a woman from across the narrow sea with no real understanding of Westerosi politics, and no sense of the lines that must not be crossed. The king's small guard fought, of course. Some died defending their sovereign, and others were captured alongside him. Word was sent to King's Landing, carried by a raven bearing the impossible message that the king was being held prisoner in Duskendale, that Lord Darklyn demanded concessions and pardons and privileges as the price of his release. The news struck the capital like a thunderbolt. Nothing like this had happened in living memory. Kings had been killed in battle, had died of illness or accident, had even been murdered by ambitious relatives, but taken hostage by a minor lord. Held prisoner and used as a bargaining chip, it was unprecedented, shocking, a violation of every custom and tradition that held the realm together. Tywin Lannister's response was immediate and characteristic. He raised an army and marched on Duskendale, surrounding the town with overwhelming force. His intention was clear. Lord Darklyn would release the king unharmed, or Duskendale would be utterly destroyed. Every man, woman and child within its walls put to the sword as an example of what happened to those who laid hands on the king's person. It was a brutal calculus, but perhaps the only one that made sense. To negotiate with Darklyn to grant his demands would be to show that taking the king hostage was a viable strategy, and that could not be allowed. But this approach had one terrible problem. If Tywin attacked, if his forces stormed Duskendale, Lord Darklyn would almost certainly kill Aerys before surrendering. The king would die, and while this might serve the larger political purpose of demonstrating that hostage-taking was futile, it would still mean the death of the king, the succession crisis that would follow, the chaos and uncertainty that might tear the realm apart. Tywin was willing to accept this outcome if necessary, which tells you something about his character and about his assessment of Aerys's value to the realm, but he hoped for an alternative. That alternative came in the person of Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard. Barristan the Bold, as he was known, was one of the finest knights in the Seven Kingdoms, brave and skilled and utterly devoted to his duty to protect the king. He came to Tywin with a plan. He would infiltrate Duskendale alone, find where the king was being held and rescue him. It was an audacious plan, the kind of thing that sounds more like a story from a song than a serious military strategy, but Barristan was the kind of man who could make such plans work. Tywin agreed, perhaps because he saw no better option, or perhaps because he recognised that having Barristan attempt the rescue would preserve the possibility of getting Aerys back alive, while still maintaining the pressure of the surrounding army. If Barristan succeeded, wonderful. If he failed, Tywin could still storm the town and destroy it, claiming that he had exhausted all alternatives before resorting to violence. Sir Barristan entered Duskendale in secret, using his knowledge of castles and his considerable skills to evade the Darklyn guards. The exact details of his infiltration and rescue have been embellished in the telling and retelling over the years, becoming the stuff of legend, but the essential facts are clear. He found where Aerys was being held, killed several guards in the process of reaching him, and spirited the king out of Duskendale before Lord Darklyn fully realised what was happening. Aerys was free. He had been held captive for 6 months, half a year in the hands of Lord Darklyn and his wife, and now he was safe, returned to his army, to his hand, to his throne. Tywin's army stormed Duskendale in the aftermath of the escape, and Lord Darklyn and his household were captured. The question of their punishment was now before the king. What happened during those 6 months of captivity we do not fully know. Aerys never spoke of it in detail, and those who held him died for their crime, carrying their secrets to the grave. But we can infer much from what came after. From the man who emerged from Duskendale compared to the man who had entered, the Aerys who returned from captivity was not the same person. Something fundamental had broken. He had been humiliated, held prisoner by a lord he considered far beneath him. He had been helpless, completely at the mercy of others, unable to command or control or even protect himself. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in being king, in being powerful and important, and in control. This experience was shattering. We might imagine what those 6 months were like. The fear, constant and gnawing, not knowing if each day might be his last. The humiliation of being guarded and confined, treated not as a sacred sovereign, but as a piece of property to be traded. The rage at his own helplessness, at Darklin's presumption, at Tywin's slow siege approach, at everyone and everything. The paranoia that must have grown in those months, the wondering who had betrayed him, who had known of the plot, who could be trusted. And perhaps, though this is speculation, there was abuse. Physical or psychological torment meant to break his will, to make him more compliant with his captor's demands. Lady Sarala was said to have a cruel streak, and her husband was desperate. They may have treated their royal prisoner well, fearing the consequences of harming him, or they may have vented their own fear and frustration on the one person they had power over. We simply do not know. What we do know is that the king who returned was changed. His eyes held a wildness that had not been there before. His laugh, when it came, was too high and too sharp. His moods, always mercurial, became violently unpredictable. And he was angry, deeply and constantly angry, in a way that went beyond mere bad temper into something darker and more dangerous. The first sign of this new Aerys came in his treatment of the Darklins. Lord Dennis and his family were brought before the Iron Throne in chains. Tywin, ever practical, counselled execution for the traitors but mercy for the town of Duskendale itself. The small folk there had not chosen their lord's actions, and destroying an entire prosperous town would harm the realm without serving any real purpose beyond vengeance. Aerys agreed to the executions, but insisted on carrying them out in his own way. Lord Dennis Darklin was beheaded, a relatively quick and clean death appropriate to his noble status, but the king was not satisfied with this. He ordered Lady Sarala tortured to death, her screams echoing through the Red Keep for days before she finally expired. He ordered the execution of all the Darklin kin, including children. He had the town's sept torn down, and the septon who had ministered to his captors flayed alive. These were not the actions of a king dispensing justice. These were the actions of a man seeking revenge, trying to purge his humiliation through cruelty, trying to make someone pay for what had been done to him. Tywin watched these executions with his characteristic stone face, but those who knew him well said he was troubled, recognizing that something in the king had shifted into dangerous territory. In the aftermath of Duskendale, Aerys became obsessed with his own safety. He had learned that he was vulnerable, that his body could be seized and held, that his power could be rendered meaningless by a few determined men with swords. This knowledge terrified him, and his response to terror was paranoia. He began to see plots everywhere. Every whisper was a conspiracy, every glance a sign of treachery. Varys, his master of whisperers, fed this paranoia with reports of suspected disloyalty, possible threats, rumours of discontent. Whether Varys was genuinely reporting real intelligence, or simply telling the king what he wanted to hear in order to increase his own influence, is a question historians still debate. What's certain is that Aerys listened avidly to these reports and acted on them with increasing severity. Lords who had done nothing wrong found themselves accused of treason on the flimsiest of evidence. Some were imprisoned, others executed, others stripped of their lands and titles. The king's justice, which had been relatively fair in the early years of his reign, became arbitrary and cruel. Those who protested their innocence were taken as proof of their guilt. Those who confessed under torture were executed for the crimes they had admitted. There was no winning, no way to prove loyalty that the king would accept. This atmosphere of paranoia and fear extended to the Red Keep itself. Aerys began to distrust the Kingsguard, the very men sworn to protect him, wondering if they might have been complicit in his capture at Duskendale. He kept them at a distance, surrounding himself instead with informers and sycophants. He had secret passages built throughout the castle, ways to move without being seen, escape routes in case of another attempt to capture him. The Red Keep became a maze of hidden doors and listening posts, every corner potentially containing a spy. The king's appearance began to deteriorate. He had always been vain about his looks, spending hours on his grooming and clothing. But after Duskendale, he became convinced that barbers and servants who came too close might be assassins. He refused to let anyone cut his hair or trim his beard, so both grew long and wild. He wouldn't allow anyone to cut his nails, so they grew into yellowed talons. He bathed infrequently, and his clothing, once immaculate, became stained and dishevelled. This physical decline was shocking to those who remembered the beautiful prince, the handsome young king. The silver-gold hair became matted and tangled. The fine features disappeared behind the unkempt beard. The purple eyes, once clear and bright, took on a feverish quality. He looked less like a king and more like a madman, and the resemblance was not merely superficial. The Iron Throne itself seemed to reject him. The throne that Aegon the Conqueror had forged from 1,000 swords was deliberately uncomfortable, meant to remind whoever sat upon it that ruling was hard work, that a king should never sit easy. It was also dangerous, its many swords still sharp after 3 centuries. A careless movement could result in a cut, and over the years various kings had suffered such cuts without much consequence. But Aerys seemed to cut himself constantly on the throne. Small cuts that bled more than they should, that left him marked and scarred. His hands were covered in tiny wounds from the armrests. His legs bore scratches from the swords that formed the seat. Some said the throne was rejecting him, that the swords could sense an unworthy king. More likely, his own agitation and constant fidgeting led to more contact with the sharp edges than a calmer king would experience. But the symbolism was potent, and people noticed. The saying arose, when a king cuts himself on the Iron Throne, it means the throne has judged him and found him wanting. Aerys bled often, and the whispers grew. He heard these whispers, of course, and they fed his paranoia further. Even the throne, even the very symbol of his authority seemed to be against him. His relationship with Queen Rhaella deteriorated further. She had been frightened by his captivity, had prayed for his safe return, had genuinely grieved for him. But the man who returned was not the man she'd married, for all that their marriage had never been happy. This new Aerys was capable of casual cruelties that shocked even those accustomed to his selfishness. He began to abuse her physically, striking her for imagined slights or simply when his mood turned black. The King's Guards, sworn to protect the royal family, were forced to stand outside the royal chambers and listen to the Queen's cries, unable to intervene because the King had commanded them not to. This was a particular torment for men like Sir Barristan Selmy, who had saved the King's life and now had to witness how that life was being used to inflict suffering. The King's paranoia about his safety extended to paranoia about his bloodline. Rhaella suffered more miscarriages and stillbirths after Duskendale, and Aerys became convinced that these were the result of poison or witchcraft, that enemies were somehow reaching into the royal womb to kill his children. He had servants tortured to confess to crimes they hadn't committed. He had maesters investigated for possible complicity. He raged at Rhaella herself, as if the deaths of their unborn children were somehow her fault, her weakness or betrayal. This period saw the rise of the pyromancers in Aerys's court. The Alchemists' Guild, the organisation of men who made wildfire, the substance the common folk called the substance, had long existed in King's Landing, but they had never enjoyed particular royal favour. Wildfire was dangerous and unpredictable, useful for certain limited applications, but not something most wise rulers wanted to involve themselves with extensively. But Aerys became fascinated with wildfire. Perhaps it reminded him of the dragons his ancestors had lost, the fire that had once been the Targaryens' ultimate weapon. Perhaps he was drawn to its destructive power, seeing in it a way to strike at the enemies he imagined everywhere. Or perhaps in his deteriorating mental state, he simply found the green flames beautiful and comforting. He began to favour the pyromancers over the maesters, appointing them to positions of influence, consulting with them on matters that had nothing to do with alchemy. The Wisdom Rossart, the guild's leader, became one of the king's closest advisors, whispering in his ear about the power of wildfire, about how it could protect the king from all threats. Under royal patronage, the guild expanded, producing wildfire in greater quantities than ever before. What Aerys planned to do with all this wildfire was unclear, even to those around him. He spoke vaguely about defence, about ensuring that no one could ever hold him captive again, about having the power to burn his enemies no matter where they hid. These were not the words of a sane strategic mind. They were the words of someone lost in fantasies of power and revenge, someone who had been broken by fear and was trying to rebuild himself around rage. Through all of this, Tywin Lannister remained as Hand, though his position became increasingly untenable. He watched the king he'd served for 20 years descend into madness. He witnessed the court he had carefully managed devolve into a nest of paranoia and cruelty. He tried, in his limited way, to moderate the worst of Aerys's impulses, to protect the realm from its king. But Tywin's power was waning. Aerys no longer trusted him, no longer listened to his counsel with any real attention. The king resented his hand more than ever, seeing in Tywin's competence and reputation a rebuke to his own inadequacy. The whispers that Tywin was the one truly running the realm, which had always bothered Aerys, now infuriated him. He wanted to be rid of Tywin, wanted to prove that he didn't need his hand, that he could rule on his own. But he was also afraid to dismiss Tywin outright. The Lannisters were powerful, wealthy, and respected. Tywin had served loyally for 2 decades, had saved the realm from bankruptcy, had raised the army that rescued Aerys from Duskendale. To dismiss him without cause would alienate a crucial pillar of support and make Aerys look petty and paranoid, which he was, but which he didn't want to openly acknowledge. So instead of dismissing Tywin, Aerys began to humiliate him. Small slights and insults, calculated to wound pride without quite justifying resignation. He would overrule Tywin's decisions publicly, making his hand look foolish or ineffective. He would make jokes at Tywin's expense before the court, mocking his seriousness or suggesting that he was getting old and slow. He would praise other councillors extravagantly while barely acknowledging Tywin's contributions. Tywin endured this with his characteristic stone-faced dignity, but those who knew him could see the anger building beneath the surface. Tywin Lannister was many things, not all of them admirable, but he was competent and proud and not accustomed to being treated with such disrespect. The question was not whether he would eventually leave the king's service, but when and under what circumstances. During this period, Prince Rhaegar was growing into a young man. He was everything his father was not: thoughtful, kind, genuinely concerned with justice and the welfare of the realm. He was also melancholy, carrying himself with a sadness that seemed beyond his years. Those who knew him said he was obsessed with prophecy, with the idea that he had some crucial role to play in events yet to come. He spent long hours reading ancient texts, studying the prophetic writings of the past, trying to understand what was expected of him. Rhaegar's relationship with his father was complex and painful. He loved Aerys, as sons love their fathers, but he also saw clearly what the king was becoming. He witnessed the cruelty, the paranoia, the deterioration. He heard his mother's cries and was powerless to protect her. He saw the realm suffering under his father's increasingly erratic rule, and felt the weight of responsibility for eventually setting things right. There were quiet discussions among certain lords and councillors about whether Rhaegar might be persuaded to take a more active role in governance, to essentially rule in his father's name while Aerys remained king in title. This was dangerous talk, the kind that could be construed as treason if it reached the wrong ears. But it happened nonetheless, whispered in corners, hinted at in private meetings, because the alternative, allowing Aerys to continue unchecked, seemed increasingly untenable. Rhaegar himself was reportedly troubled by these suggestions. He was dutiful and had no desire to usurp his father's throne. But he also couldn't deny the reality of what he saw. His father was mad, and that madness was harming the realm. At some point, duty to the throne might require acting against the king. It was a terrible dilemma, one that Rhaegar wrestled with but never fully resolved. The realm during this period was in a strange state. On the surface, things continued much as they had. The harvest was still good, trade still flourished, the king's peace still mostly held. Tywin's 20 years of competent administration had created systems and institutions that could run themselves for a time, even as the king who nominally led them descended into madness. But beneath the surface there was growing unease. The Great Lords saw what was happening, and the years following Duskendale saw Aerys' transformation from troubled king to something far darker and more dangerous. The paranoia that had taken root during his captivity grew like a cancer, spreading through his mind until it touched everything, coloured every interaction, poisoned every relationship. He became a man who trusted no one, who saw enemies in every shadow, who interpreted every action through the lens of conspiracy and betrayal. The physical deterioration we've already noted, the long tangled hair and yellowed nails, the cuts from the Iron Throne that never seemed to fully heal, these were merely the outward signs of an inner collapse. Aerys' mind was fracturing, and the cracks were becoming impossible to hide or ignore. His mood swung wildly from grandiose confidence to abject terror, from cruel amusement to explosive rage, often within the span of a single conversation. Those who had known him in his youth, who remembered the charming prince with the quick wit and ready smile, found it almost impossible to reconcile that memory with the creature he had become. It was as if two different people occupied the same body, or perhaps as if the prince had died at Duskendale, and something else had crawled into his skin, and was wearing it poorly, unable to quite mimic the man who had been. His treatment of Queen Rhaella grew even more terrible during these years. The abuse was no longer occasional but constant, a regular feature of their interactions. He accused her of infidelity, of carrying bastards, of plotting against him, accusations that had no foundation in reality, but which he believed with absolute conviction. When she was pregnant, he claimed the child wasn't his. When she miscarried or delivered a stillborn baby, he blamed her weakness or wickedness or secret poisonings. The Kingsguard stationed outside the royal chambers during these episodes faced an impossible situation. They were sworn to protect the royal family, but the king had commanded them not to interfere in his marriage, no matter what they heard. Men like Sir Jaime Lannister, who had joined the Kingsguard as a boy of 15 in the 281st year after the conquest, stood outside those doors night after night, listening to the Queen's screams and the King's ravings, their white cloaks and shining armour suddenly feeling like costumes in a particularly cruel farce. Jaime had been appointed to the Kingsguard at Aerys' insistence over Tywin's strong objections. On the surface, it was a great honour, the youngest knight ever to don the white cloak, chosen for his skill and his famous beauty. But the true purpose was more sinister. Aerys had stolen Tywin's heir, taken the son who was supposed to inherit Casterly Rock, and bound him to lifelong celibacy and service to the crown. It was a deliberate insult, a way of striking at his hand while appearing to honour House Lannister. Tywin had been furious, seeing the appointment for exactly what it was. His son's dreams of marriage and heirs and ruling the Westerlands were destroyed at the king's whim, and there was nothing Tywin could do about it without appearing to reject the honour and insult the crown. It was a masterful piece of cruelty, perhaps the cleverest thing Aerys did during his entire descent into madness, and it would be one of the factors that eventually drove Tywin from his service. But for young Jaime, the reality of serving in the Kingsguard under the Mad King was very different from the romantic ideal he had imagined. He had joined expecting to protect the king from dangers, to serve with honour as the great knights of history had done. Instead, he found himself guarding a madman who hurt his own wife, who made increasingly cruel and arbitrary decisions, who valued his Kingsguard not as protectors, but as witnesses to his power, forced to watch and unable to act. The small council meetings became exercises in terror rather than governance. No one wanted to disagree with the king, fearing that contradiction might be taken as treason. Tywin still tried to provide honest counsel, still attempted to moderate the king's worst impulses, but he was increasingly alone in this effort. The other councillors had learned to simply agree with whatever Aerys said, to praise his wisdom and implement his commands no matter how impractical or harmful. Grand Maester Pycelle, who served as the council's maester and as an advisor to the king, proved to be particularly adept at this kind of sycophancy. He would nod along with Aerys's ravings, would assure the king that his paranoid fantasies were grounded in reality, would provide learned commentary that supported whatever position the king had already taken. Whether Pycelle actually believed what he was saying, or was simply trying to survive by telling the king what he wanted to hear, is unclear. Perhaps it was both, or perhaps after enough time spent agreeing with madness, one begins to see it as reasonable. Varys, the master of whisperers, continued to feed the king information about plots and conspiracies. His little birds, the network of spies and informants he maintained throughout the realm, brought him secrets and rumours that he would then share with Aerys, always framed in ways that confirmed the king's existing suspicions. A lord who spoke critically of royal policy became a potential traitor. A merchant who complained about taxes became part of a conspiracy to undermine the crown. Every piece of information was transformed into evidence of danger. The question of Varys's motivations during this period is one that has puzzled historians. Was he a true believer in the Targaryen cause, trying to protect the dynasty even as its king went mad? Was he an opportunist using the king's madness to increase his own power and influence? Or was he working towards some other goal, some longer game that wouldn't become clear until years later? We may never know with certainty, but what is clear is that his whispers made Aerys worse, made the paranoia deeper and more entrenched. The wildfire production increased dramatically during these years. Aerys commissioned the pyromancers to produce more and more of the volatile green substance, far more than any reasonable defensive or offensive purpose would require. The Alchemists Guild worked day and night, brewing the substance in their carefully controlled chambers, storing it in clay pots sealed with wax, accumulating a stockpile that grew larger with each passing moon. What Aerys intended to do with all this wildfire was a question that worried many of those around him, though few dared ask directly. He spoke vaguely about having a weapon that would protect him from all enemies, about possessing the power that his ancestors had wielded when they had dragons. He talked about fire being the ultimate purifier, the solution to all problems, the answer to all threats. These were not the words of a strategic mind thinking about practical applications of a military resource. These were the words of someone obsessed, someone who had fixated on fire as a solution to the terror and helplessness he had felt at Duskendale. If he had enough fire, if he could command flames hot enough and vast enough, no one would ever be able to hurt him again. It was a child's logic, simple and direct and utterly disconnected from the realities of governance and warfare. The Wisdom Rossart, the leader of the Alchemists Guild, became one of Aerys's most trusted advisors during this period. He had the king's ear in a way that even the Hand did not, whispering about the properties of wildfire, about its power and potential. Rossart was ambitious and saw in the king's obsession an opportunity for his guild to gain unprecedented influence and resources. Whether he understood that he was enabling a madman's delusions, or whether he convinced himself that he was serving some greater purpose, is unknown. This was Aerys's revenge, his way of striking back at the Hand who had overshadowed him, who had been too competent and too respected. It was petty and cruel and politically short-sighted, because it transformed Tywin from a loyal if resentful servant into an enemy. But Aerys was beyond such calculations by this point. He wanted to hurt Tywin, and he had found a way to do so that the Hand could not openly resist without seeming to reject a great honour. Tywin's response was cold and immediate. He resigned as Hand of the King, something he had never done despite decades of increasing frustration and insult. He announced that he was returning to Casterly Rock, leaving the king's service after 20 years. It was a devastating blow to the realm, though Aerys was too lost in his own satisfaction at having bested his hand to fully recognise it. The resignation occurred quietly, without dramatic confrontations or public recriminations. Tywin was too disciplined for such displays. He simply informed the king that he was stepping down, gathered his things, and left King's Landing with his daughter Cersei, who would not be a queen after all. He left his son Jaime behind, trapped in the White Cloak, a hostage to his own honour and the king's spite. The realm watched this departure with deep unease. Tywin Lannister had been the competent administrator who kept everything running despite the king's madness. His departure left a void that no one seemed capable of filling. Aerys appointed new hands, but they were lesser men, chosen for loyalty rather than competence, unable or unwilling to stand up to the king's increasingly erratic commands. Without Tywin's moderating influence, Aerys's worst impulses had even freer rein. The executions increased. The paranoia deepened. The obsession with wildfire grew into something even more concerning. The pyromancers began to place caches of wildfire throughout King's Landing, hidden in strategic locations beneath the city. This was done at Aerys's command, though the full scope of the plan was known only to the king and a few of his most trusted pyromancers. The stated purpose of these caches was defence, creating the capability to destroy any enemy who might threaten the city. But the actual effect was to turn King's Landing into a potential inferno, with enough wildfire hidden beneath its streets and buildings to burn the entire city to ashes. 500,000 people lived in King's Landing, the largest city in Westeros, and beneath their feet slept enough wildfire to kill them all. They didn't know this, of course. The placement of the caches was kept secret, known only to those directly involved. This period also saw changes in how Aerys conducted himself in public. He had never been comfortable with crowds after Duskendale, had developed a fear of being among people who might seize him or harm him. He began to appear less frequently before his subjects, retreating deeper into the Red Keep, holding court less often. When he did appear, he was surrounded by guards, jumpy and suspicious, often cutting his public appearances short if he felt threatened by some imagined danger. The small folk of King's Landing began to whisper about the Mad King, though they did so quietly, aware that such talk could be dangerous. They saw him rarely, and when they did, he looked more like a wild hermit than a king. The tales of his cruelty, of the people he burned for small offences or no offences at all, spread through the city. People learned to be careful, to avoid drawing royal attention, to keep their heads down and hope that the king's madness would pass over them without touching them. Prince Rhaegar, now a young man, married Elia Martell of Dorne in the 280th year after the conquest. It was a good match politically, binding Dorne more closely to the crown, and Elia was said to be kind and gracious, if not robust in health. Rhaegar seemed fond of her, though those who knew him said his fundamental melancholy never lifted, that he carried himself like a man bearing a great weight. Aerys was not invited initially, or rather, the tournament was organised without royal involvement by Lord Walter Went of Harrenhal, who claimed to be celebrating his daughter's name day. This exclusion, whether intentional or simply a matter of the tournament being a private rather than royal affair, fed into Aerys's paranoia. He became convinced that the tournament was actually a cover for a great council, that Rhaegar and the lords were gathering to plot against him, to set him aside and place the prince on the throne. So Aerys decided to attend the tournament himself, uninvited with a large guard and a suspicious eye. His presence cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration. He watched the jousts and melees with a paranoid intensity, looking for signs of conspiracy, interpreting every private conversation as potential treason. His appearance shocked those who hadn't seen him in some time. The deterioration was obvious, the madness visible in his eyes and bearing. The tournament is remembered for many things, but most famously for its conclusion, when Prince Rhaegar won the joust and was given the honour of crowning the tournament's Queen of Love and Beauty. Tradition dictated that he should crown his wife Elia, who was present and watching. But Rhaegar rode past Elia and placed the crown of winter roses on the lap of Lyanna Stark, the daughter of Lord Rickard Stark and betrothed to Robert Baratheon. This moment has been analysed and reanalysed by historians, trying to understand what Rhaegar was thinking, what he meant by this gesture. Was it simply an expression of admiration, a chivalric gesture with no deeper meaning? Was it a political statement of some kind, or was it the beginning of something deeper, an attraction that would lead to events that would destroy the Targaryen dynasty? What's certain is that the gesture caused a scandal. Elia was humiliated, sitting in the stands watching her husband honour another woman. Robert Baratheon was furious, seeing the gesture as an insult to his betrothed and to himself. Lyanna's reaction is less well documented, but she accepted the crown, and the realm took note. Aerys watched all of this with his paranoid eyes and drew his own conclusions. He saw his son honouring a Stark, one of the great houses of the realm, in a way that could be interpreted as politically significant. He wondered if this was part of the conspiracy he suspected, if Rhaegar was building alliances for the Great Council he feared was being planned. The king's madness made him see plots everywhere, and this very public gesture seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. The tournament ended, and the lords dispersed to their domains, but the consequences of that moment would ripple outward, touching everything that followed. Rhaegar and Lyanna's story would continue in ways that no one at Harrenhal could have predicted, and those ways would lead directly to war, to the sack of King's Landing, to the end of the Targaryen dynasty, but that was still months away. For now, in the aftermath of the tournament, Aerys returned to King's Landing, convinced more than ever that enemies surrounded him, that his son might be plotting against him, that only his vigilance and his wildfire kept him safe. The madness was complete now, the transformation from promising prince to paranoid tyrant absolute. The man who had once charmed courts and dreamed of glory was gone, replaced by something twisted and dangerous, something that wore a crown and sat a throne and had the power to destroy everything it touched. The final act of the tragedy was approaching, though no one yet knew exactly what form it would take. The pieces were in place, the tensions wound tight, and all it would take was one more spark to set everything ablaze. The final years before the rebellion were marked by a series of events that, in retrospect, seem almost deliberately designed to push the realm toward catastrophe. Each incident built upon the last, tensions accumulating like storm clouds gathering on the horizon until the breaking point became inevitable. The story of how the Mad King's reign ended begins, strangely enough, with a wedding that never happened, and a son who felt he had no choice but to defy his father. In the early months of the 282nd year after the conquest, perhaps half a year after the tournament at Harrenhal, news reached King's Landing that sent ripples of shock through the realm. Prince Rhaegar had, it seemed, abducted Lyanna Stark. The word abduction was used by those who reported the event, though whether it was truly an abduction or something else entirely, an elopement perhaps, has been debated by historians ever since and may never be fully resolved. What we know with certainty is this: Lyanna Stark disappeared from her father's custody while travelling near the crossroads in the Riverlands. She was in the company of guards and attendants, yet somehow she vanished, and Prince Rhaegar was seen in the area at the same time. Whether he took her by force, whether she went willingly, whether something more complex was happening involving prophecy or politics, or simply love, the truth disappeared with them into whatever refuge they sought. The news reached her betrothed, Robert Baratheon, and her brother, Brandon Stark, before it reached King's Landing. Brandon was the eldest son of Lord Rickard Stark, heir to Winterfell, a young man known for his bold nature and quick temper, possessed of what the Starks called the wolf blood, that impulsive courage that sometimes served them well and sometimes destroyed them. When he heard that his sister had been taken by the Crown Prince, His response was immediate and, in retrospect, catastrophically unwise. Brandon Stark rode directly to King's Landing with several companions, all young men of good families, sons of lords and heirs to great houses. He rode to the Red Keep itself and shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die, challenging the prince to single combat, demanding his sister's return. It was a bold gesture, the kind of thing that might appear heroic in a song, but in reality it was a death sentence delivered by his own hand. Rhaegar was not in King's Landing at the time. He was wherever he had taken Lyanna, hidden away in some refuge whose location remains uncertain to this day. Some say the Tower of Joy in Dawn, others suggest different locations, but the exact place matters less than the fact that he was not present to answer Brandon's challenge. The person who was present, who heard Brandon Stark shouting threats against the Crown Prince outside the Red Keep, was King Aerys. To Aerys, in his paranoid madness, Brandon's arrival seemed to confirm everything he had suspected. Here was proof of the conspiracy, a Stark come to King's Landing with armed companions, shouting threats against the royal family. It didn't matter that Brandon was demanding justice for his sister, or that his challenge was directed at Rhaegar rather than the king. What mattered to Aerys was that this was treason, open and undeniable, and he had the traitors in his grasp. Brandon and his companions were arrested immediately. They were not given trials, not allowed to present their case or explain their actions. They were simply taken into custody, thrown into the black cells beneath the Red Keep, those lightless dungeons where the Crown kept its most dangerous prisoners. Lord Rickard Stark, Brandon's father, was summoned to King's Landing to answer for his son's crimes, and he came, bringing 200 Northern Knights, expecting to face legal proceedings and to argue for his son's release. What happened next was so shocking, so far outside the bounds of acceptable conduct even by the standards of medieval justice, that it unified the realm against Aerys in a way that nothing else could have. The king decided that Lord Rickard and Brandon would face trial, but not a trial by jury or by judicial combat in the traditional sense. They would face trial by fire, and the champion opposing them would be wildfire itself. The exact details of the executions vary in the telling, but the essential horror remains consistent across all accounts. Lord Rickard Stark was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his armour, hung by chains while a fire was lit beneath him. The armour was designed to protect a man from swords and arrows, but it conducted heat all too well. As the flames grew hotter, the armour became an oven, cooking Rickard Stark alive inside his own protective shell, while he screamed for mercy that never came. Brandon was forced to watch his father die. He was placed in a Taroshi strangling device, a cruel contraption that placed a leather cord around his neck and a sword just out of his reach. If he could reach the sword, he might be able to cut himself free and save his father. But the device was designed so that reaching for the sword tightened the cord around his neck. Brandon Stark strangled himself trying to save his father, dying inches away from the blade that might have freed him, while his father roasted in his armour. This was not justice. This was not even the cruel justice that medieval societies sometimes practiced. This was torture and murder, deliberate and calculated to cause maximum suffering. Aerys watched these deaths with evident pleasure, laughing at times, calling for more fire, enjoying the screams and the desperate struggles. The lords who witnessed these executions, and there were several dozen present in the throne room, were horrified. Some were physically sick. All were afraid, recognizing that they served a king who had crossed from mere madness into active evil. But Aerys was not finished. The other young men who had ridden with Brandon to King's Landing were also executed, though their deaths were at least quicker. Fathers were summoned to court to witness their sons die, to be forced to watch and do nothing, to be reminded of their own helplessness before royal power. It was a demonstration, a message sent to the entire realm. This is what happens to those who threaten the crown, who speak against the king, who question his authority. Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon joined the rebellion immediately. For Ned, it was a matter of family and justice. His father and brother had been murdered by a mad king, and now that same king demanded his head for crimes he had not committed. For Robert, it was more personal and more passionate. The woman he loved had been taken, and the king who should have helped him reclaim her had instead murdered her father and brother. Robert's rage was legendary, a storm of fury that would drive him through the coming war with relentless energy. The realm divided quickly. Some lords declared for the rebellion, convinced that Aerys had gone too far and needed to be stopped. Others remained loyal to the crown, either out of genuine belief in the sanctity of the king's person, or out of fear of what would happen if they joined a failed rebellion. Still others waited, watching to see which side would gain the advantage before committing themselves. Aerys's response to the rebellion was characteristic of his madness. He saw it as confirmation of the conspiracy he had always suspected, proof that he had been right to be paranoid, that enemies truly did surround him and plot his destruction. He called for loyal lords to bring him the heads of the traitors, promised rewards and honours to those who would fight for their king. But his promises rang hollow, because everyone knew that service to the Mad King was more likely to end in execution than reward. The king's strategic thinking, such as it was, focused on defence rather than offensive action. He trusted in the strength of King's Landing's walls, in the loyalty of certain powerful houses who had not yet declared for the rebels, and most of all in his wildfire. He had Rossart and the other pyromancers increase production, adding to the already substantial caches hidden beneath the city. In Aerys's mind, the wildfire was his ultimate protection, the weapon that would destroy any enemy who dared approach his capital. During this period, Queen Rhaella was sent away to Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen fortress on the island in Blackwater Bay. She was pregnant again, having conceived shortly before the rebellion began, and Aerys wanted her and the unborn child away from the potential danger of King's Landing. This decision was perhaps the only remotely prudent action Aerys took during the entire rebellion, though his motivations were likely more about preserving the Targaryen bloodline than protecting his wife. Rhaella went to Dragonstone with a small household accompanied by the young Prince Viserys, her son by Aerys. Rhaegar's wife Elia and their children, the Princess Rhaenys and the infant Prince Aegon, remained in King's Landing. Aerys kept them close, not out of affection but as hostages, insurance against Dornish betrayal. The message was clear. Dorne would remain loyal to the crown, or Elia and her children would suffer for it. Prince Rhaegar himself was still absent from King's Landing, still wherever he had taken Lyanna Stark. His absence was notable and damaging to the royal cause. The prince was popular, respected, seen as the hope for the realm's future. If he had been present, if he had led the loyalist forces, many lords who hesitated might have declared for the crown. But with only the Mad King to rally around, with Rhaegar's whereabouts unknown and his actions unclear, the loyalist cause struggled to inspire the kind of devotion that might have turned the tide. The war itself saw several major battles and many smaller skirmishes. Robert proved to be a formidable military commander, winning victories through a combination of personal courage, strategic thinking, and the kind of inspiring leadership that made men willing to follow him into desperate situations. The Battle of Summerhall, the Battle of Ashford, and most famously the Battle of the Bells in Stony Sept. These engagements established Robert as a military force to be reckoned with. At the Battle of the Bells, Robert was wounded and in hiding in the town of Stony Sept when loyalist forces under Lord John Connington arrived to find and kill him. The townsfolk hid Robert, and when John Connington began searching house by house, they rang the bells of every sept in town, creating confusion and buying time. The rebel forces arrived before Connington could find Robert, and the resulting battle was a rebel victory. Connington, having failed to capture or kill Robert when he had the chance, fell out of favour with Aerys, who saw failure as potential treason and exiled him. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Loyalist commanders who failed to achieve victory, even through no particular fault of their own, found themselves suspected and punished by a king who saw betrayal everywhere. This made serving Aerys a losing proposition, because success would earn minimal reward while failure would bring terrible consequences. The incentive structure pushed competent lords toward neutrality, or even toward the rebels, who at least rewarded loyalty and didn't execute their own commanders for losing battles. Through all of this, Tywin Lannister remained at Casterly Rock, declaring for neither side. His position was complex and calculating. He had reason to hate Aerys, who had humiliated him and stolen his son. But he was also cautious, unwilling to commit his considerable military might until he could see which side was likely to prevail. Tywin was always a pragmatist, and pragmatism dictated waiting, watching, preserving his strength until the moment when he could use it most advantageously. The turning point of the war came at the Trident, the great river that runs through the Riverlands. Prince Rhaegar finally emerged from his hiding place, whatever it was, and took command of the Loyalist forces. His appearance rallied many who had been wavering, because Rhaegar was everything Aerys was not: noble, capable, concerned with justice and duty. If the war could be won and Rhaegar placed on the throne in Aerys' stead, many thought, then perhaps the realm could be saved. The armies met at a ford in the river, tens of thousands of men on each side, in what would be the decisive battle of the entire rebellion. The fighting was fierce and bloody, as such battles always are, men struggling and dying in the water and on the muddy banks. But the battle came down to single combat between the two leaders, between Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Robert Baratheon. They fought in the water of the Trident, two men who represented not just themselves but entire causes, entire visions of what the realm should be. Rhaegar wore his distinctive armour, with a three-headed dragon of House Targaryen wrought in rubies on the breastplate. Robert wielded his great warhammer, the weapon he had made famous through his victories. They traded blows, and for a time it seemed either might prevail. In the Red Keep, Aerys finally understood that he had been betrayed, that Tywin had outmaneuvered him, that the end was coming. His response was not surrender or negotiation, or any attempt to preserve what could be preserved. Instead, he turned to his final solution, the weapon he had been preparing for years, the protection he believed would save him from all enemies. He sent for Rossart, his favourite pyromancer, the man he had recently appointed as Hand of the King in place of those who had failed him. He gave Rossart the command that would echo through history, the command that would define his entire reign in just 3 words: burn them all. The city waited, unknowing, as Rossart went to light the fires, and Aerys waited for his transformation, and Jaime Lannister stood with his hand on his sword. Facing the most terrible decision any knight has ever had to make, this was not even the madness of desperation, not a final desperate gamble by a man who knew he was beaten. Aerys genuinely believed in his transformation, spoke of it with the certainty of religious conviction. He was not trying to deny his enemies' victory by destroying what they sought to capture. He was trying to ascend, to become something greater, to prove that he was special, chosen, immune to the forces that constrained ordinary men. When Rossart left the throne room to carry out the king's command, Aerys began to pace, muttering to himself, working himself into a state of almost ecstatic anticipation. The few courtiers and servants who remained in the Red Keep, those who had not fled when the Lannister army entered the city, watched their king with horror and incomprehension. Some understood what was about to happen and tried to slip away to escape before the fire started. Others simply stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. The King's Guard present in the throne room that day included Jaime Lannister, barely 20 years old, son of the man whose army was sacking the city beyond the castle walls. Jaime had joined the King's Guard as a boy, drawn by romantic notions of honour and service, by the image of the White Knight protecting the innocent and defending the realm. The reality of his service had been nothing like that dream. He had stood guard while the king raped the queen. He had watched Aerys burn men alive for imagined offences. He had seen cruelty and madness and understood that his sacred oaths had bound him to protect a monster. But this was different. Everything Jaime had witnessed before had been terrible, yes, but it had been terrible on a scale he could comprehend. Individual victims, discrete acts of cruelty, horrors that were contained even if they were profound. This was something else entirely. This was the murder of a city, the extinction of hundreds of thousands of innocent lives, the destruction of one of the great achievements of human civilization. Jaime had been raised to value honour above all things. His father Tywin, for all his cold pragmatism, had drilled into his children the importance of the family name, of reputation, of being seen to keep one's word. The Kingsguard oaths Jaime had sworn were the most sacred oaths in the Seven Kingdoms, the promises that could not be broken without staining one's honour forever. To protect the king, to obey his commands, to defend him from all enemies, these were not merely words but bonds that shaped the soul of everyone who spoke them. And yet 500,000 people were about to die. Men, women, children, babes in arms, the old and the young, the guilty and the innocent, all would burn together if someone did not stop it. The question that Jaime faced was simple in its statement, but terrible in its implications. Which oath mattered more, the oath to the king or the oath to protect the innocent? The books about knights and honour that Jaime had read as a boy had never addressed this question. They assumed that the king would be noble, that his commands would be just, that a knight could serve with honour and never face the kind of choice that required breaking sacred vows. But those books were stories, and this was reality, and reality did not offer clean choices or easy answers. Rossart was moving through the Red Keep, heading toward his first destination, carrying the command that would doom the city. Aerys was in the throne room, pacing and ranting, waiting for his transformation. And Jaime was standing there with his hand on his sword, feeling the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him like a physical force. The decision, when it came, was not the result of careful moral reasoning or ethical calculation. There was no time for philosophy or debate. Jaime acted on instinct, on a fundamental recognition that allowing this horror to proceed would be worse than any personal dishonour he might suffer. He left the throne room, walking quickly but not running, not wanting to alert anyone to what he was doing. He knew where Rossart would be going, knew the routes through the Red Keep that the pyromancer would use. He found Rossart in a corridor, moving with purpose toward the stairs that would take him down to the underground passages. The pyromancer saw Jaime approaching and smiled, assuming the Kingsguard knight was there to escort him, to protect him as he carried out the king's command. Rossart had served Aerys faithfully for years, had risen from obscurity to become Hand of the King through his willingness to enable the king's worst impulses. He had no reason to think that anyone would interfere with his mission. The Mad King ran for the Iron Throne, perhaps thinking it would protect him, or perhaps simply fleeing on instinct with no real plan. He was old and weak and half mad, and Jaime was young and strong and trained in arms. There was no contest, no dramatic duel, just a frightened old man trying desperately to escape, and a knight who had made his choice and would see it through. Jaime caught Aerys before he reached the throne. He drove his sword through the king's back, the blade emerging from his chest in a spray of red. Aerys fell, crying out, and Jaime pulled the sword free and struck again, cutting the king's throat to be certain, to ensure that no final command could be given, that no last words could send some waiting pyromancer to light the fires. The blood that poured from Aerys's throat was the same red as any man's blood. There was no dragon fire, no transformation, no magical apotheosis. He died as all men die, his life leaving him in a rush of blood and a final gasping breath, his eyes going blank and empty. All the madness and paranoia and cruelty finally ended. Jaime looked down at what he had done, at the body of the king he had killed, and felt the weight of it settle onto him. He had broken his oath. He was Kingslayer now, a title that would follow him for the rest of his life, a stain on his honour that no amount of justification could fully wash away. He had saved the city, yes, but he had done so through murder and betrayal, and the world would judge him harshly for it. He walked to the Iron Throne, that seat of twisted swords where Aegon the Conqueror had first sat 300 years before, where every Targaryen king since had ruled. He sat upon it, not claiming it for himself, but simply sitting, exhausted and blood-spattered, waiting for whatever would come next. His white cloak was stained with the king's blood. His golden sword dripped red onto the throne room floor. He was a knight who had killed his king, and he sat on that king's throne because he no longer knew what else to do. When Eddard Stark entered the throne room at the head of the first rebel forces to reach the Red Keep, this was the scene he found. Young Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne with his sword across his lap, and the body of King Aerys at the throne's foot, throat cut and eyes staring at nothing. Ned had ridden hard to reach King's Landing, hoping to prevent the worst excesses of the sack, hoping to find the king alive so that Robert could dispense justice rather than arriving to find the deed already done. Ned looked at Jaime with disgust and disappointment. Here was the famous Kingsguard knight. Sworn to protect the king, sitting on the throne he should have defended with his life. The king he should have protected dead at his feet. It looked like the worst kind of treachery, like Jaime had murdered his king to curry favour with the victors, or perhaps to claim the throne for himself or his father. The optics were terrible, and Ned Stark was a man who valued honour and oaths above almost everything. Jaime saw the judgment in Ned's eyes and felt the injustice of it. He had saved the city, had prevented a catastrophe beyond imagination, had made the hardest choice any knight could make. And this man, this northern lord who knew nothing of what had truly happened, looked at him with contempt, saw only a betrayer and an oathbreaker. Jaime could have explained. He could have told Ned about the wildfire, about Aerys's plan, about why the king had to die. But he didn't. Perhaps it was pride, the Lannister pride that would not stoop to justify itself before accusers. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that follows terrible decisions made in crisis. Or perhaps it was a kind of despair, a recognition that no explanation would matter, that the title of Kingslayer would follow him regardless, that the truth was less important than the story people would tell. So Jaime said nothing, or nothing of substance. He made a jest, something cutting and dismissive, and stood from the throne and walked away, leaving Ned to think what he would. The judgment had been made, and Jaime would wear it like the white cloak he had stained red, a mark of shame that was also, though no one would acknowledge it, a mark of courage. While this confrontation played out in the throne room, other dramas were unfolding elsewhere in the Red Keep. Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch, two of Tywin Lannister's most brutal and loyal servants, had been given a specific task to eliminate the remaining Targaryen heirs in the city. Princess Elia and her children, Rhaenys and baby Aegon, were in Maegor's Holdfast, the most secure part of the Red Keep, protected by thick walls and guarded doors. The guards at the Holdfast were overwhelmed quickly by Clegane and his men. What happened next was among the most horrific crimes of the entire rebellion, acts so brutal that they shocked even those hardened to the casual cruelties of medieval warfare. Gregor Clegane killed baby Aegon, smashing his head against a wall with such force that the child's skull shattered. He then raped and murdered Princess Elia while her daughter's body lay nearby, having been stabbed dozens of times by Amory Lorch. The final days of Aerys's reign deserve closer examination, not because they reveal anything fundamentally new about his character, we have already seen what he was, but because they show us the mechanics of how madness intersects with power in its most extreme form. They show us the moments when abstract plans become concrete actions, when the theoretical capacity for destruction transforms into actual preparations for mass murder. They reveal the infrastructure of atrocity, the mundane details that make the unthinkable possible. The wildfire plot that Aerys conceived was not a sudden impulse born in the chaos of the rebellion's final days. It was a project that had been years in the making, growing and evolving as his paranoia deepened and his grip on reality loosened. The initial caches had been placed during the period after Duskendale, when Aerys first became obsessed with fire as protection and power. But the scope of the plan expanded dramatically as the rebellion progressed. As it became clear that his enemies were winning, that his throne was genuinely threatened. The Alchemist Guild had been working at a feverish pace throughout the rebellion, producing wildfire in quantities that far exceeded any legitimate military or ceremonial need. The substance itself is fascinating in a terrible way, a product of ancient knowledge that the pyromancers guard jealously. Wildfire burns green, hot enough to melt stone and steel, and once lit it cannot be extinguished by water or by smothering. It simply burns until its fuel is exhausted, consuming everything it touches with a hunger that seems almost alive. But wildfire is also desperately unstable. Temperature affects it, making it more volatile in summer heat and somewhat less so in winter cold. Vibration can trigger ignition, which meant that moving the clay jars from the brewing chambers to their hiding places throughout the city was an exercise in constant terror. The pyromancers who transported the wildfire knew that a single stumble, a jar dropped or knocked against a wall, could mean their deaths and the deaths of everyone nearby in a green inferno that would spread faster than men could run. The locations chosen for the wildfire caches showed a certain terrible logic, a strategic mind still functioning beneath the madness. The Sept of Baelor was targeted because it was a symbol of the faith, the religious institution that had never fully accepted Targaryen incest and dragon worship. If Aerys was going to burn the world, he would start with the gods who had judged him and found him wanting. The placement of wildfire beneath the Sept was also practical in its horror. When ignited, the cache would destroy the building and everyone in it, and the burning Sept would serve as a beacon, a signal visible across the city that the end had come. Flea Bottom, the poorest district of King's Landing, where the small folk lived in overcrowded tenements and struggled to survive from day to day, was another major target. Here the logic was purely destructive. Flea Bottom was densely populated, its buildings packed together, its narrow streets perfect for channeling flames. A fire started there would spread rapidly, consuming block after block, trapping people in their homes or forcing them into streets that had become corridors of flame. The wildfire cache beneath Flea Bottom was one of the largest, designed to ensure that this part of the city would be utterly annihilated. The destruction would have extended beyond the immediate fire damage. King's Landing was the largest city in Westeros, the centre of trade and administration, the seat of royal power. Its annihilation would have sent shockwaves through the entire realm. The economic impact alone would have been catastrophic, disrupting trade networks, destroying wealth, creating refugees by the hundreds of thousands. The political impact would have been even worse, creating a vacuum of power at the centre of the realm at exactly the moment when the transition from Targaryen to Baratheon rule was being negotiated. And for what? What would this destruction have accomplished beyond satisfying the delusions of a madman? Aerys believed it would transform him, would make him a dragon, would demonstrate his power and his special nature. But even if we grant the impossible and imagine that he somehow survived the fires, what then? He would be king of ashes, ruler of a smoking ruin, sovereign over corpses and char. The realm would have risen against him with unified horror, every surviving lord and commoner united in the desire to destroy the monster who had committed such an atrocity. His dynasty would have ended not in defeat but in utter obliteration, the Targaryen name becoming synonymous with the greatest crime in human history. The moment when Jaime killed Rossart in the corridor was the moment when the wildfire plot truly ended, though Jaime could not have known this for certain at the time. Rossart was the coordinator, the one who would have signalled the other pyromancers to light their fires. Without him, the carefully constructed plan fell apart. The pyromancers at their various stations throughout the city waited for a signal that never came, and as the hours passed and the city descended into the chaos of the sack, they gradually understood that something had gone wrong. that the plan had failed or been abandoned. Some of them took the initiative to light the fires anyway, believing they were fulfilling the king's will even without explicit orders. But these individual efforts were contained, discovered, and extinguished before they could spread, or they burned only the immediate area and then exhausted their fuel without triggering the citywide conflagration that the coordinated effort would have produced. Others simply fled. Recognizing that the Targaryen cause was lost, and that being identified as one of the Mad King's pyromancers in the new regime would be exceedingly dangerous. They slipped away into the chaos of the sack, shed their guild robes, and disappeared into the population or fled the city entirely, carrying with them the knowledge of where they had placed their caches, but no longer having any reason to share that knowledge. And so the wildfire remained, most of it unfound, sleeping beneath the city in hidden chambers and sealed tunnels, a legacy of madness that would persist for generations. It was a reminder that the Mad King's plot, while it failed, was not entirely defeated. The threat he created outlived him, waiting in the darkness beneath King's Landing, ready to fulfill his vision of fire and destruction if anyone ever found it and had reason or madness enough to light it. When Jaime killed Aerys in the throne room, cutting his throat and watching him bleed out on the floor, he was not just ending a life or a reign. He was ending the immediate threat, ensuring that no final command could be given, that no last-moment signal could be sent to waiting pyromancers. The king's death was the final seal on the plot's failure, the absolute guarantee that whatever Aerys had planned would not come to pass, at least not that day, not in the way he had envisioned. The blood that spread across the throne room floor was just blood, ordinary and red and mortal. There was no fire, no transformation, no magical apotheosis. Aerys died as men die, his delusions offering him no protection, his special nature revealing itself to be nothing more than madness and self-deception. The dragon he believed himself to be was exposed as a man, weak and frightened and mortal, bleeding out on cold stone while his killer walked away. And yet, in a sense, Aerys achieved a kind of immortality, though not the kind he sought. He would be remembered, his name spoken for as long as people told stories of Westeros and its history. But he would be remembered as the Mad King, as the tyrant who tried to burn his own city, as the cautionary tale about what happens when power and madness combine. His legacy was not glory but horror, not admiration but revulsion, and his name would be invoked whenever people wanted to illustrate the dangers of unchecked royal authority or the consequences of ignoring the signs of mental illness in those who wield power. The throne room when he entered was much as he had left it, though the atmosphere had changed. The few courtiers and servants who remained were edging toward the exits, sensing that something terrible was about to happen, wanting to be elsewhere when it did. Aerys was still ranting, still calling for the pyromancers, his voice rising to a shriek as he demanded to know why the fires had not started, why his transformation was delayed. When the king saw Jaime approaching with his sword drawn, there was a moment of recognition, a flash of understanding in those mad purple eyes. Aerys had always been paranoid, had always seen enemies and traitors everywhere he looked. Now, in the final moments of his life, his paranoia was vindicated. His own Kingsguard, his sworn protector, was coming to kill him. The betrayal he had always feared was finally happening, though not in the way he had imagined, not as part of some elaborate political conspiracy, but as a simple, desperate act to prevent mass murder. Aerys's eyes went blank, the light leaving them, the madness that had animated them for so long finally stilled. His last breath left his lungs in a wet rattle, and then he was gone, dead on the floor of his own throne room, murdered by the knight sworn to protect him. The Mad King's reign had ended not in fire and transformation, but in blood and ignominious death. His final view not the glory he had imagined, but the cold stone floor and the boots of his killer. Jaime looked down at what he had done, at the body of the king he had killed, and felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. He had saved the city, yes. 500,000 people would live because of his choice, would wake up tomorrow and go about their lives never knowing how close they had come to death, never understanding that they owed their survival to a young man who had broken his most sacred oaths. But the price of that salvation was high, paid not by those who were saved, but by the man who saved them. Or perhaps it was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes after crisis and terrible choices. Jaime had killed 2 men that day, had broken his most sacred oaths, had changed the course of history through violence and betrayal. Explaining it to someone who had not been there, who had not faced the choice, might have seemed pointless or impossible. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you justify the unjustifiable? Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that feels truest to who Jaime was, it was a kind of despair, a recognition that the truth was less important than the story, that no explanation would matter because people would believe what they wanted to believe regardless of facts. The title of Kingslayer was already his, had been earned the moment his sword entered Aerys' back. Explaining why he had done it would not remove that title, would not restore his reputation, would not undo the breaking of his oaths. So Jaime said nothing of substance, or rather he made a jest, something cutting and dismissive that confirmed Ned's worst impressions and ended the conversation before it could truly begin. He stood from the throne and walked away, leaving Ned to think what he would, to spread whatever story he chose, to judge without understanding. The judgment had been made, and Jaime would live with it, would wear the title of Kingslayer like a scar, visible and permanent. Rhaenys Targaryen was 3 years old, a child who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong parents at the wrong time. She was found hiding under her father's bed, frightened by the noise and violence, and she was dragged out and stabbed dozens of times by Amry Lorch, who later claimed he had not been certain it was the princess, and had wanted to make sure she was dead. This explanation was transparent and pathetic, but it was accepted because punishing the crime would have been politically inconvenient. The baby Aegon was perhaps 6 months old, too young to understand what was happening, aware only of noise and fear and the absence of the mother who normally comforted him. Gregor Clegane killed him by dashing his head against a wall, a brutally efficient method that ensured death, while also sending a message about the fate that awaited those who stood in the way of Lannister ambitions. The baby's body was wrapped in a crimson cloak before being presented to Robert Baratheon, as if cloth could somehow make the crime less visible, or less terrible. Princess Aelia herself was raped and murdered, the assault carried out by Clegane while her daughter's body lay nearby and her son's blood was still wet on the wall. She was a woman of Dorne, part of the marriage alliance that had bound Dorne to the Targaryen cause, and her death was not just personal tragedy but political statement. It told Dorne that their princess had not been valued or protected, that the new regime had no respect for Dornish dignity or Dornish lives, that the alliance that had seemed so solid had collapsed into betrayal and murder. The bodies were presented to Robert Baratheon wrapped in Lannister crimson, a deliberate choice by Tywin to make clear who had committed these murders and why. This was not the work of rogue soldiers or the unfortunate chaos of war. This was policy, calculated political murder carried out to demonstrate loyalty and commitment. Robert, seeing the small corpses, was reportedly horrified, revolted by the brutality even as he recognised its political utility. Here Robert faced his own terrible choice, his own moment of decision that would define his character and his reign. He could condemn the murders, could punish those responsible, could reject Tywin's offering, and make clear that such crimes would not be tolerated in the new regime. This would have been the morally correct choice, the decision that aligned with justice and decency and the protection of the innocent that he had claimed to be fighting for. But it would also have been politically dangerous. Tywin Lannister was powerful, wealthy, and commanded armies that Robert needed to consolidate his new rule. Rejecting Tywin's demonstration of loyalty, punishing the murders that were meant to prove Lannister commitment, would risk alienating a crucial ally at the moment when the new regime was most vulnerable. It might even drive Tywin back into neutrality or opposition, might reignite the war that had seemed nearly won. He never spoke of the wildfire, never explained what he had prevented or why Aerys had to die. The secret of what almost happened that day was buried with the Mad King, known only to Jaime and to the few who had been involved in the plot. The city went on living, 500,000 people continuing their lives in blessed ignorance of how close they had come to annihilation, how dependent their survival had been on the choice of one young man who had decided that some things mattered more than oaths. The immediate aftermath of Aerys' death created a strange moment of suspension in the Seven Kingdoms, a brief period when the Old Order had ended but the New Order had not yet fully taken shape. The Mad King was dead. The Targaryen dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years was broken, and a new king would sit on the Iron Throne. But the transition between these states, the space between what was and what would be, created uncertainties and opportunities that different people navigated in different ways. Robert Baratheon's coronation took place with appropriate ceremony and grandeur, the High Septon placing the crown on his head, the great lords of the realm bending their knees and swearing fealty. Robert looked every inch the conquering hero, tall and strong and vital, his black hair and blue eyes giving him a commanding presence that Aerys in his later years had utterly lacked. The contrast was deliberate and important, a visual representation of the change that had occurred, the replacement of madness with strength, of paranoia with confidence. But beneath the pageantry and the celebrations, there were complications and compromises that would shape everything that followed. The alliance between Robert and Tywin Lannister, sealed by Robert's marriage to Cersei, was built on the foundation of murdered children, a fact that everyone knew, but that political necessity required them to ignore. Jon Arryn, serving as Hand of the King, worked to smooth over tensions and create functional governance. But he was managing a regime whose origins were morally compromised in ways that would have consequences for years to come. The great lords who had supported the rebellion were rewarded with honours and positions, their loyalty recognised and compensated. Those who had remained loyal to Aerys faced various fates depending on their importance and the practicality of punishing them. Some were stripped of lands and titles, some were forced into exile. Some were pardoned and allowed to keep their positions in exchange for swearing new oaths of fealty. The realm was being reorganised, the political landscape reshaped to reflect the new reality of Baratheon rule. But some Targaryens survived, fled, scattered to the winds in the hope that they might one day return. On Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen fortress on its volcanic island in Blackwater Bay, Queen Rhaella had given birth to her last child during a storm of legendary ferocity. The accounts describe winds that tore stones from the castle walls, waves that crashed over the cliffs and flooded the lower levels, lightning that struck again and again as if the gods themselves were protesting the dynasty's end. The question of what to do with the surviving Targaryen loyalists in Westeros itself was complex and politically fraught. Some houses had declared for Aerys and fought for him until the end, suffering defeats and losses in service to a mad king. Should they be punished for their loyalty, even though that loyalty was to the rightful king at the time? Or should they be pardoned and integrated into the new regime, their past service forgotten in favour of future cooperation? Yet everyone involved in this effort knew that their work was incomplete. The city was large, the possible hiding places numerous, and the pyromancer's knowledge fragmentary. Some caches almost certainly remained undiscovered, hidden in locations that only the pyromancers who placed them knew, and many of those pyromancers were dead or missing. King's Landing would have to live with the knowledge that somewhere beneath its streets, in some forgotten tunnel or sealed chamber, wildfire might still be sleeping, waiting for the wrong vibration or the wrong amount of heat to trigger an explosion. This uncertainty became part of the city's character, a shadow that hung over the celebration of the new regime. The people who lived in King's Landing, who went about their daily lives in the markets and workshops and homes, mostly did not think about the wildfire beneath them. It was too abstract, too uncertain, and daily life demanded attention to more immediate concerns. But those who knew, who had been involved in the removal efforts or who had served in the Red Keep during Aerys's final days, carried the knowledge with them, a constant low-level anxiety about what might be lurking in the darkness below. The fate of the Kingsguard who had served Aerys raised difficult questions about loyalty and honour. These knights had sworn sacred oaths to protect the king, and most of them had kept those oaths even as Aerys descended into madness. Were they to be commended for their loyalty, or condemned for serving a tyrant? Should they be allowed to continue serving in the Kingsguard under the new regime, or were they too tainted by association with the Mad King? Jaime Lannister remained in the Kingsguard despite having killed the king he had sworn to protect. This was partly because his father was now a crucial ally of the new regime, making it politically difficult to punish him, and partly because removing him would require acknowledging why he had killed Aerys, which would mean revealing the wildfire plot and the near-miss catastrophe that most people did not know about. It was easier to simply let him remain, accepting his continued service while allowing his reputation as a Kingslayer to serve as its own form of punishment. The other surviving Kingsguard faced their own reckonings. Sir Barristan Selmy, who had served with distinction and had saved Aerys from captivity at Duskendale, was pardoned by Robert and allowed to remain in the Kingsguard. Robert valued Barristan's skill and reputation, and Barristan's service had always been honourable even when the king he served was not. This decision was generally well received, seen as an appropriate recognition of the difference between serving a king and endorsing his crimes. Others were less fortunate. Dismissed from the Kingsguard or forced into exile, their service to Aerys marking them as unsuitable for the new regime. The white cloaks that had represented the pinnacle of knightly honour became tainted by association with the Mad King, their wearers suspected of having stood by while atrocities were committed, of having heard the Queen's screams and done nothing, of having watched men burn and remained at their posts. This collective guilt, this sense that the Kingsguard as an institution had failed its most basic purpose of protecting the innocent, would haunt the Order for years to come. The organisation that Visenya Targaryen had created 3 centuries before, that had produced some of the greatest knights in Westerosi history, was now associated with moral compromise and the enabling of tyranny. Restoring its reputation would require time and the service of knights who could demonstrate that honour and duty were compatible, that protecting the king did not mean facilitating evil. The popular belief was that Rhaegar had kidnapped and raped her, that she had been a victim of Targaryen cruelty just as her father and brother had been. This narrative fit neatly with the story of Aerys as tyrant and the Targaryens as a family that needed to be removed. But there were hints of a more complex truth, suggestions that Lyanna had gone willingly, that her relationship with Rhaegar was not what it seemed, that the promise she extracted from Ned related to a child born of that relationship. The truth, whatever it was, died with Lyanna and was buried with Ned's silence. Robert never learned it, never understood that the woman he loved might have loved someone else, that his war might have been based on a misunderstanding. This ignorance was perhaps a mercy, allowing him to remember Lyanna as he wished to remember her, uncomplicated by truths that would have pained him. Ned's decision to raise Jon Snow as his bastard, to accept the stain on his honour that such an acknowledgement brought, became one of the enduring mysteries of the post-rebellion period. Why would a man known for his rigid sense of honour admit to fathering a bastard? Why would he bring that bastard to Winterfell, raising him alongside his legitimate children despite his wife's objections? The most obvious answer was that Jon truly was his bastard, the product of some wartime affair that Ned regretted but took responsibility for. But those who knew Ned well, who understood how deeply he valued honour and fidelity, found this explanation difficult to accept. It was too out of character, too inconsistent with everything else about him. The alternative, That Jon was not his son, but someone else's child whom he was protecting, raised other questions. Whose child? And why would Ned sacrifice his reputation to protect someone else's bastard? The answer, which would not be revealed for many years, was that Jon was Lyanna's son, born of her relationship with Rhaegar Targaryen, and that Ned had promised his dying sister to protect the child from Robert's hatred of all things Targaryen. By claiming Jon as his own bastard, Ned had hidden the boy's true parentage, had kept him safe from a king who would have killed him for his father's blood, had sacrificed his own honour to keep a promise to a sister he loved. This sacrifice, this willingness to bear shame and endure his wife's anger to protect a child, was perhaps more honourable than any amount of publicly visible virtue. But it was a private honour, unknown and unrecognised, carried in silence and isolation. Like Jaime's decision to kill Aerys to save the city, it was a good act that looked like wickedness, a moral choice that damaged reputation while saving lives. The parallels between Ned and Jaime in this regard are striking and worth contemplating. Both men made choices that violated the codes they were supposed to live by, Jaime breaking his oath to the king. Ned appearing to break his marriage vows. Both chose to protect the innocent at the cost of their own reputations. Both carried secrets that isolated them and shaped how others saw them. And both were judged harshly by a world that did not understand the full context of their actions. The difference was that Ned's secret would eventually be revealed, his sacrifice understood and recognised, while Jaime's would remain largely unknown. His reputation as Kingslayer persisting long after the reasons for it had been forgotten. This disparity in how their choices were remembered and understood reflects the arbitrary nature of historical judgment, the way that truth can be lost or distorted, that the same act can be seen as vice or virtue depending on what is known about it. The new regime under Robert Baratheon attempted to establish itself on principles of justice and law, to create a government that would be different from Aerys's madness. Jon Arryn, as Hand of the King, worked tirelessly to create fair administration, to ensure that disputes were resolved through legal processes rather than arbitrary royal decree, to rebuild the institutions that had deteriorated during the final years of Targaryen rule. In many ways he succeeded, creating a government that functioned well and served the realm's interests, but the foundation remained compromised by the murdered children, by the unpunished crimes that political necessity had required them to accept. This compromise haunted the regime, created a moral weakness at its core that would have consequences in years to come. When difficult choices arose, when principle conflicted with expediency, the precedent had been set. The regime had begun with moral compromise, and such compromises tend to multiply rather than remain isolated incidents. These questions mattered because they affected how people thought about kingship and power, about the structures that should exist to check royal authority, about what should be done when a king goes mad. The Westerosi system had few mechanisms for dealing with incompetent or insane rulers, short of outright rebellion. The king was the king. Chosen by birth, ordained by the gods according to traditional belief, and removing him required either his death or a level of organised resistance that bordered on civil war. The rebellion against Aerys had succeeded, but at enormous cost in lives and treasure and moral compromise. Was there a better way? Could institutions be designed that would allow for the removal of a mad king without requiring mass warfare? Or was the current system, with all its flaws and dangers, the best that could be managed given human nature and the realities of power? These were questions without easy answers, questions that scholars and maesters would debate for. The maesters who have studied this pattern point to the practice of incestuous marriage that the Targaryens maintained for centuries. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, first cousins married each other, all in an effort to keep the bloodline pure, to preserve whatever special qualities the Valyrian blood was thought to contain. This practice, maintained generation after generation, had genetic consequences that the Targaryens themselves did not fully understand but that manifested in the prevalence of stillbirths, miscarriages, deformities, and mental instability. The evidence for a genetic component to Targaryen madness is compelling. The family tree is full of individuals who showed signs of mental illness. From Maegor the Cruel's sadistic violence to Baelor the Blessed's religious mania to Aerion Brightflame's belief that drinking wildfire would turn him into a dragon. These were not isolated incidents but a recurring pattern, suggesting something systemic in the Targaryen bloodline that predisposed family members toward instability. But genetics alone does not fully explain Aerys. Many Targaryens who shared the same degree of inbreeding, who had similar family trees full of incestuous marriages, did not become mad. Jaehaerys I was one of the greatest and wisest rulers in Westerosi history, presiding over a golden age of peace and prosperity. Daeron II was thoughtful and effective, bringing dawn into the realm through marriage alliance rather than conquest. Aegon V was beloved by small folk and lords alike for his attempts to improve the lives of common people. These questions have no simple answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. The human mind is complex, and mental illness is not a binary condition but a spectrum, varying in severity and manifestation from person to person. Aerys was clearly suffering from some form of severe mental dysfunction in his final years, experiencing delusions and paranoia that distorted his perception of reality. But he was also making choices, acting on impulses, creating plans like the wildfire plot that required sustained effort and coordination. The tension between seeing him as sick and seeing him as evil is not resolvable through choosing one perspective over the other. Both are true simultaneously. He was a man whose mind had broken, who was experiencing reality in ways that were fundamentally distorted, and who therefore deserved some measure of compassion. And he was also a tyrant who tortured and murdered innocent people, who planned mass destruction on an unprecedented scale, and who therefore needed to be stopped by any means necessary. Baelor the Blessed, who ruled about a century and a half before Aerys, showed a different manifestation of Targaryen madness. He was pious to the point of dysfunction, fasting until he nearly died, walking barefoot to dawn over scorpions and broken glass, imprisoning his own sisters in a tower to preserve their virtue. His reign was marked by religious excess rather than violence, but it was still a form of madness, a disconnection from reality that impaired his ability to govern effectively. Aerion Brightflame, a prince who died about 70 years before Aerys' reign, believed that drinking wildfire would transform him into a dragon. He actually did it, actually drank the substance, and died screaming as it burned him from the inside. This was clearly a delusion similar to Aerys' belief in his own transformation through fire, but Aerion was not king, and thus his madness affected only himself and those immediately around him, rather than threatening an entire realm. What distinguishes Aerys from these other examples is partly the position he held, and partly the specific form his madness took. He was king, with absolute authority and the resources of a realm at his disposal, and his madness manifested in grandiose plans for destruction that combined paranoid fears with magical thinking in particularly dangerous ways. The convergence of power, madness, and the specific obsession with fire created a situation where one man's delusions could threaten hundreds of thousands of lives. This raises questions about power itself and how it interacts with mental illness. Power does not necessarily cause madness, but it can amplify whatever tendencies already exist, remove restraints that might otherwise contain dysfunction, and transform personal pathology into public catastrophe. A mad peasant might harm his family or neighbours, which is tragic but limited in scope. A mad king can harm entire kingdoms, can make decisions that affect millions, can turn his delusions into policy and his paranoia into purges. The isolation that comes with absolute power may also contribute to the deterioration of judgment. Aerys, especially in his later years, was surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, who reinforced his paranoid beliefs rather than challenging them. Tywin had provided some counterbalance in the early years, offering honest counsel even when it contradicted the king's wishes. But as their relationship deteriorated and Tywin eventually resigned, Aerys lost that moderating influence. Instead, he had Varys whispering about conspiracies, Pycelle agreeing with whatever he said, and the pyromancers encouraging his obsession with fire. These people may not have intended to make things worse, may have thought they were serving the king or protecting themselves or pursuing their own agendas. But the effect was to create an echo chamber where Aerys's worst impulses were validated rather than checked, where madness was treated as insight and paranoia as justified caution. This dynamic, where powerful people become isolated from honest feedback and surrounded by yes-men and flatterers, is not unique to Aerys or to Westeros. It is a recurring pattern throughout history, a structural problem that affects many forms of concentrated authority. The higher someone rises, the more difficult it becomes for others to tell them hard truths, and the more isolated they become from the reality experienced by ordinary people. The role of enablers in Aerys's reign deserves particular attention. The pyromancers who brewed the wildfire, the courtiers who witnessed his cruelties without objecting, the King's Guard who stood outside the Queen's chambers and listened to her screams, all of these people facilitated the atrocities through their actions or inaction. None of them individually caused the catastrophe, but collectively they made it possible. This was convenient for the new regime, but perhaps missed the deeper lesson, which was that any system that concentrates enormous power in a single individual is vulnerable to catastrophic failure if that individual proves unfit. The problem was not unique to the Targaryens, even if they provided a particularly dramatic example of it. Any king could become tyrannical or incompetent, and the structures that allowed Aerys to do such damage could allow other rulers to do similar damage in the future. The question of whether Aerys could have been helped, whether some intervention earlier in his deterioration might have changed the outcome, is poignant and ultimately unanswerable. The maesters of Westeros have some understanding of the mind and its disorders, but nothing approaching modern psychiatry or psychology. They knew that people could become mad, could lose their grip on reality, but they had limited ability to treat such conditions, even if effective treatment had been available. Administering it to a king would have been enormously difficult. Who had the authority to declare the king mad and require him to submit to treatment? How could such treatment be implemented when the king had absolute power and could execute anyone who tried to restrain or medicate him? The very nature of monarchy, with its concentration of power in a single person, made it nearly impossible to intervene when that person's judgment became impaired. This is another structural problem without easy solutions. In a society where the king's authority is absolute and sacred, where questioning the king's fitness is tantamount to treason, how do you address the situation when the king genuinely becomes unfit? The mechanisms for doing so are either non-existent or require actions that undermine the entire basis of monarchical legitimacy. Perhaps the tragedy of Aerys is not just personal, but systemic. Not just the story of one man's descent into madness, but the story of a political system that could not effectively address that descent until it had progressed to the point of catastrophe. The rebellion succeeded in removing him, but only after enormous suffering and loss, and the removal required a war that killed thousands and traumatized generations. As we contemplate these questions, we might also consider what Aerys's story teaches us about the nature of leadership and the qualities we should value in those who hold power. The charming prince who became the mad king had many gifts in his youth, intelligence and charisma and ambition. But he lacked certain crucial qualities, stability and empathy, and the ability to accept limits on his desires. These absences, combined with the vulnerabilities in his bloodline and the traumas he experienced, created a perfect storm of dysfunction. The lesson might be that charm and intelligence are not enough, that leadership requires emotional stability and moral character in addition to capability and vision. A brilliant strategist who's also paranoid and cruel will do more harm than a mediocre ruler who is stable and decent. The question is how to identify these qualities before giving someone power, and how to remove power when the person wielding it proves unfit. These are not questions unique to Westeros or to fictional realms. They are questions that every society faces, that every system of governance must address in some way. The specifics differ, the mechanisms vary, but the fundamental challenge remains: how to ensure that those who have power use it wisely and justly, and what to do when they do not. Aerys Targaryen's reign provides no clear answers to these questions, but it illustrates their importance with terrible clarity. His madness, his cruelty, his plan to burn King's Landing, all of these horrors emerge from the intersection of individual pathology and systemic failure, of personal breakdown and structural inability to address that breakdown effectively. The realm survived Aerys, barely, through a combination of luck and individual courage and the specific circumstances of his final days. But the survival was contingent, dependent on factors that might easily have been different, and the cost was enormous even in success. The question that lingers is what will happen next time, when another ruler proves unfit, when madness or tyranny or simple incompetence threatens the realm again. Will the mechanisms exist to address the problem? Will individuals make the hard choices that conscience demands? Or will the patterns repeat, the tragedies unfold again, the lessons of history forgotten or ignored? These are heavy questions, perhaps too heavy for the hour growing late and the mind seeking rest. But they are worth carrying with us, worth contemplating in quiet moments, worth allowing to shape how we think about power and responsibility and the choices we all face in our own lives and times. We've travelled together through one of history's darkest chapters, watched a prince become a king, become a monster, traced the slow unraveling of a mind and the near destruction of a city. It's been a heavy journey, full of difficult questions and uncomfortable truths, full of choices that had no good options and people who did terrible things for complicated reasons. The Mad King story is not a comfortable one, not a tale that ends with simple lessons or easy morals. It's messy and tragic and human in all the ways that history tends to be when we look at it honestly. But you've stayed with me through all of it, through the madness and the wildfire, through the choices that saved a city and the compromises that stained a regime. Thank you for that patience, for that willingness to sit with discomfort and complexity, to contemplate questions without demanding simple answers. These slow explorations of difficult history are valuable, I think, not because they provide certainty, but because they help us understand how human beings navigate impossible situations, how societies function and fail, how power and madness and courage all intertwine. If you found some value in this journey, if these contemplative nights help you find peace at the end of difficult days, a like and subscription would mean a great deal. And to those already part of this community, who return night after night for these slow drifts through history and story, thank you. You make this worthwhile. Now, as we reach the end of our exploration, let yourself settle more deeply into comfort. The story is told, the questions asked. The Mad King's reign examined from every angle we could manage. There's nothing more you need to think about tonight, no more weight to carry. The tale of Aerys Targaryen, for all its darkness, is also a reminder that even the worst moments pass, that cities threatened with annihilation can be saved, that individual choices matter even when systems fail. King's Landing survived. 500,000 people woke up the morning after Aerys' death with no idea how close they had come to burning, and they went about their lives, and the city continued, and the world turned. The wildfire beneath the streets remains in some forgotten places, perhaps, a reminder that dangers can lurk unseen. But life goes on regardless, resilient and stubborn and beautiful in its ordinariness. The realm moved forward from Aerys' madness into whatever came next, carrying the scars and lessons and consequences, but moving forward nonetheless. This is what we do, as individuals and as societies. We survive terrible things, we make impossible choices, we carry burdens that seem unbearable, and somehow we continue. There's courage in that continuation, a quiet heroism in simply going on when everything seems broken. You've been patient with this long exploration, this slow drift through fire and madness and the spaces between honor and survival. Now you can let it all go, can release the Mad King and his burning city and the young knight who saved it at the cost of his reputation. These are just stories after all, tales told in the dark to help us understand our own world and our own choices. They've served their purpose for tonight. Let your breathing slow, deep and easy, the kind of breath that comes when you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying. Feel your body sinking into whatever supports it, muscles releasing tension they no longer need to hold. Your mind can drift now, can wander away from Westeros and its histories, can find its way towards sleep and dreams and rest. Somewhere in the imagined world we've been exploring, the stars are coming out over King's Landing, the same stars that shone before Aegon's conquest and will shine long after the last Targaryen is gone. The city sleeps beneath them, unaware of its own history, the people in their beds dreaming ordinary dreams of ordinary lives. The Iron Throne sits empty in the darkness, waiting for whoever will claim it next. Its thousand swords patient and sharp and indifferent to the passage of kings, and in the north, where the Starks keep their watch, where winter is always coming but has not yet arrived, the world is quiet and cold and peaceful. The old gods are silent in their godswoods, the weirwood trees with their carved faces keeping their eternal vigil. The wall stands tall against the darkness beyond, ice and ancient magic, and the Night's Watch maintains its duty, their oath simple and true. I am the sword in the darkness, the watcher on the walls, the shield that guards the realms of men. These words, spoken by men who guard against dangers both real and imagined, carry a kind of peace in them, a commitment to something larger than themselves. Your watch for tonight is ending. You've listened and contemplated and journeyed with me through difficult history. Now you can rest, can let others keep the watch while you drift into sleep. The night is dark and full of terrors. The old saying goes, but the morning will come, as it always does, and the terrors will recede like nightmares fading in daylight. For now, there's only this quiet moment, this gentle slide towards sleep. This release of everything you've been holding. The Mad King is gone. The fires are extinguished. The city is saved. The story is told. And you, dear listener, can finally rest. Let go of Westeros and its histories. Let go of questions without answers and choices without good options. Let go of everything except the simple peace of breathing and drifting and allowing sleep to come when it's ready. And now your watch is ended. Sleep well. Good night.